Hey guys, welcome to CakeWalk Cambridge. I'm Aisha, and today you're watching Chapter 19, Organisms and the Environment. Yes, I haven't posted in forever. I just got done with my AS level board exams 4 days ago, and I thought I had to upload the second last video of the bio chapter immediately. And obviously, for this chapter, I'm also going to be using my grade 10 notes. Yeah, I still have them. And yeah, I hope this helps you. And let's get started. Okay, so this chapter, you need to know a lot of definitions. You need to have an idea of the mechanisms of population growth and food chains and everything. And so for that, to understand the mechanism, you need to know the definition of each term in the food chain itself. So basically, the first thing that you need to be able to state is that the sun is the principal source of energy input to biological systems. So very often you have a 1 mark question where they ask you whether like you draw a food chain and they'll ask you to state source of energy for the food chain. And very often I have also put plants. That's wrong. The answer is always the sun. It's a 1 mark question. That's it. So basically, light energy from the sun is transferred to organisms and converted into chemical energy. So we've already seen how this happens. Light energy is absorbed by palisade mesophyll cells via photosynthesis and converted to chemical potential energy to make food, basically starch, glucose. Energy leaves the food chain in the form of heat energy. So that's also a very important 1 mark question when they ask you how it leaves the food chain. It leaves the food chain in the form of thermal energy. So yeah, now a food chain. What exactly is a food chain? A food chain shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the next, beginning with the producer. Now, producer by default is always usually a plant. That is this, as you can see, the corn here. So the producer is what absorbs the light energy from the sun and converts it into chemical potential energy, which can then be transferred to other organisms via ingestion or consumption. As you can see, energy is transferred between organisms in a food chain by ingestion. So you have corn, which is fed. So basically, yeah, the arrows. The arrows are super important. Arrows always go towards the consumer. So here the mouse is the consumer. The mouse is going to prey on the corn. The corn goes inside the mouse. So the arrow is towards the mouse. The mouse goes inside the owl. So the arrow is towards the owl. Like it's eaten by the owl. So the arrow is that way. So don't get confused between the arrows. And the arrows basically show the direction of energy flow or energy transfer. That is also a 1 mark question. What is the significance of arrows? Arrows show the direction of energy transfer. A food web. Now, food web is basically a series or a network of interconnected food chains. So here you can see one food chain is green plant, goat, and lion. Another food chain is green plant, goat, jackal, and lion. Another food chain is green plant, rabbit, jackal, and lion. So you see there are many food chains, but they're all interconnected, so they form a food web. So ideally here the tree is like the producer for all of these food chains. Okay, and even the consumers within the food chains are preying on other animals from different food chains. And that is how you can connect these food chains and form a food web. Pyramids. Okay, this concept is super important. Pyramid of numbers versus a pyramid of biomass. So a pyramid of numbers basically represents a food chain in terms of the number of organisms that are consumed at each stage or each level of the food chain. So here you have an oak tree. It's only one oak tree, so the base is going to be small. It's just one, like a tiny little thing. So if you had to draw this food chain as a pyramid of numbers, it would be, so the tree would have like this much. And you have to draw it like proportionately. They'll give you a grid with squares. So you'll have to count and draw. This is just rough. Then if you had to draw a caterpillar, so now many caterpillars would feed on the same oak tree. So it would be like this. And don't worry, they give you data for how many of each or the energy of each level. So you don't have to assume. Then here they're telling you that a few of these birds eat the caterpillar. So it'll go like this. And just like a few sparrowhawks have this bird, so that's even less. So that is basically how the pyramid of numbers goes. However, if at the bottom we had grass instead of the oak tree, the bottom layer would be like this because a lot of grass will be consumed by the caterpillars. So you basically virtually have to see if you're given something like a tree or a grass or a certain plant and the number of each that is in the table. They usually give you a table. Okay, so so this number of caterpillars have this number, this much of grass, this much of birds have this much of caterpillars, and like this amount of sparrowhawks have this much of birds. Um, Next, pyramid of biomass. Biomass basically is something to do with the energy level, basically the amount of mass in each organism. So an oak tree virtually will have the greatest biomass. Usually in pyramid of biomass, the bottom will always be the most. By default, the pyramid of biomass always has the same structure. It is a proper normal pyramid. So the bottom layer is going to be like this, then it goes like that, and then it goes like that. Whereas the pyramid of numbers depends on the number of organisms consumed at each level. The pyramid of biomass only is always the same shape, but proportionately you'll have to change it according to the numbers and data given in the table and the question. Later you'll also learn the advantage of using a pyramid of biomass over a pyramid of numbers. We will get into that as well. Okay, now remember I just spoke to you about the different levels, like the number of organisms consumed at each level or the amount of energy present in each level. So this level is called a trophic level. Okay, you can see here. And it is basically the position of an organism in a food chain, a food web, which is an interconnected series of food chains, or a pyramid of numbers or pyramid of biomass. So by default, your producer is always going to be at the first trophic level. Your consumer, so remember the first example, we had corn, mouse, owl, I think. So the corn is at the first trophic level, the mouse is at the second trophic level, and the owl is at the third trophic level. Okay, just remember, it is the number. Okay. Now basically the transfer of energy from one level to another is inefficient. What does it mean? It means that all of the energy like that is present in one trophic level will not be transferred to the next trophic level. So only 10% of the energy that is present in one level is transferred to the next trophic level. Now, why does this happen? It is because 90% of the energy present in a trophic level is lost as thermal energy to the surroundings or via the 7 life processes in the organism. So, we've learned that organisms need energy for growth and respiration, etc. and movement. So basically the animals or the consumers use the energy that they obtain to carry out these 7 life processes. So obviously there's less energy available for the next trophic level. Okay. So basically at each consecutive trophic level, only 10% energy is going through. So that means the highest trophic level is going to have the least energy. Okay, by default, it's always going to have the least energy. So due to this, okay, there a few food chain usually doesn't have more than 5 trophic levels. Five trophic levels is the maximum because there's just about enough energy for the fifth trophic level, for the consumer at the fifth trophic level to function normally. Okay, because what happens is when 90% energy is lost in these 7 life processes or thermal energy or in excretion, there's insufficient energy for another trophic level, which is why food chains are limited to 5 trophic levels at maximum. Now this whole part is extremely important. The first 4 points, you should probably mark them up or something because you can get it for like a good 4-5 marker. Okay, it's very important. And when you're writing 7 life processes, if you mention 2, you get another mark. So I usually used to write respiration or growth, but you can write respiration, growth, movement, whatever. 2. Yeah. Now another question is it more efficient to feed livestock, okay, and then cook meat and then have humans consume that meat, or is it more efficient for humans to directly consume plants? Logically speaking, based on what I just told you, obviously the second scenario is more efficient because humans are going to be at a lower trophic level in the second scenario. Because in the first scenario, you have plants, animals, humans. In the second scenario, you have plants, humans. So humans are at a lower trophic level, which means they have a greater proportion of energy that they are consuming from the plants. Therefore, it is more efficient to feed humans crop directly rather than feed livestock and then cook the livestock and then have humans consume the livestock. That's very important. It's an important question as well. They've asked it like quite a decent amount of times. Again, you have more definitions. Guys, you need to know like every definition properly. This chapter is a very mugging up kind of chapter, but it is super scoring. Like you just can't lose marks here. It is virtually impossible to, and if you do, I'd be really disappointed. Okay, yeah, so a producer. I've used the word producer a lot, but we've not defined it. A producer is an organism that makes its own organic nutrients, usually using energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. I've said that before. The corn in the first slide was the producer. It made its own organic nutrients, glucose, using energy from the sunlight, from sunlight. Then consumer is an organism that gets its energy by feeding on other organisms. One is the mouse in the first scenario. The mouse fed on the corn, it's a consumer. And also the owl. The owl fed on the mouse, so it is a consumer as well. But how do you distinguish between these two consumers? Now you have different categories of consumers. You have primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So primary consumer is the first consumer in the food chain. That is the mouse in that example. The mouse consumes another organism first, so it is the primary consumer. The owl then consumes the mouse. It's the second organism to consume another organism in the food chain, so it is a secondary consumer. Now, if the owl was eaten by another organism, that organism becomes the tertiary consumer. And if that was eaten by another, the last organism is going to be the quaternary consumer. So yeah, that is important. Then a herbivore, these are definitions that you've probably done in third grade, second grade, I don't know. A herbivore is an animal that gets its energy by eating plants, and a carnivore is an animal that gets its energy by eating other animals. A decomposer is an organism that gets its energy from dead or organic material. Um, so basically, very often there is this question in MCQs that gets people confused. So you have organism A, organism B, organism C, it goes to organism B, and you have B also going to D, and you have A also going to D, and it says identify the decomposer. Now, the decomposer is an organism that gets its energy from dead or organic material. So just remember that all organisms can be consumed by a decomposer. And in this scenario, as you can see, all the arrows are pointing to only one, which means all are consumed by one organism, which is D. So D is the decomposer. In the food chain, you can see A is the first organism to be consumed by anything. So it is going to be the producer. B is the primary consumer. C is the tertiary consumer. Okay, and D is the decomposer. That's how you do it. Here the arrows show the direction of energy transfer, that is from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to decomposer. Okay, here. And the arrows always go towards what will prey on the organism. Yeah. Okay, now this is a very popular IGCSE food web. So we're just going to look at it now. Here, you can see there are 4 organisms that start at the bottom of the food web: grass, hogweed, ivy, and oak tree. So all 4 are going to be producers. That means they get their energy from from sunlight via photosynthesis, and they convert it to chemical energy. Um, Caterpillars, aphids, goldfinches, and bank voles are all primary consumers because they are the first organisms to feed on other organisms. You can see the arrows are going towards them, which means they are feeding on the producers. Wrens are secondary consumers because they feed on aphids and caterpillars. Kestrels are both secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. Why? Secondary because they feed directly on bank voles and goldfinches. So that's one level. Two. Okay. And they're also tertiary consumers because hogweed, because aphids feed on hogweed and wrens feed on aphids. So wrens become secondary consumers and kestrels feed on wrens. So they become tertiary consumers. Here, if you have to look at trophic level, obviously oak tree, ivy, hogweed, and grass are at the first trophic level. Caterpillars, aphids, goldfinches, and bank voles are all at the secondary trophic level, second trophic level. Now, in this food chain, um, wrens are at the third trophic level and kestrels are at the fourth trophic level. But in this food chain, kestrels are at the third trophic level because there's nothing in between. Okay. Now, another, like they ask you, they make these scenarios for you. So supposing there was a disease that caused, let's say, um, that caused the number of bank voles to diminish. Okay, that means the number of bank voles became smaller. So that means bank voles are only fed on by kestrels, which means that there is less prey for kestrels from this side. So kestrels have to maintain their energy levels, which means they will feed more on goldfinches and wrens, which means there'll be a reduction in the number of goldfinches and wrens because they'll be feeding on them more. Because first, kestrels divided their food, like their preying between three organisms: bank voles, goldfinches, and wrens. But now, since bank voles are out, it's only between these two. So a larger proportion of goldfinches and wrens will be consumed, which means there'll be more hogweed left, and more aphids and more caterpillars. Which means when there are more aphids and caterpillars, there will be less ivy because more aphids means more feeding on ivy, so less ivy. More caterpillars means more feeding on oak tree, so less oak tree. Um, Less bank voles means more feeding on goldfinches. So when there's more feeding on goldfinches, there is less feeding on hogweed, which means there is more hogweed. That is basically the dynamic of a food web. If you have any questions about this, you can email me or put it down in the comments and I'll try and answer it via email or another video. Because I know this can be a little confusing. Yes. So now here, the advantages of a pyramid of biomass over a pyramid of numbers. One is that it takes into account the size or the mass of an organism. As I said, the biomass virtually refers to the size, the dry mass of an organism. So it takes into account the size of the organism. So the bottom trophic level is like big and everything. And it can always represent species on the same scale. You can mark up that point. Also, pyramid of biomass always follows the same pyramid structure. So it is easier to remember and kind of shows the flow of energy transfer. It shows the amount of energy present at each stage and how it diminishes. So those are a couple of advantages of pyramid of biomass over pyramid of numbers. You just have to memorize them. I'll say no two, just know 2 to 3 and you should be good. Okay, so we've come to the nutrient cycles. This is the carbon cycle that you've learned probably years ago. It's pretty easy. So we'll start. There's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It is absorbed, taken in by plants and trees for photosynthesis um, to produce glucose for energy. Trees then fossilize. So after they die, they fossilize. There is carbon stored in these fossils. They become fossil fuels. They are excavated, taken in by power stations, and burnt via combustion to produce energy. And this releases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere again. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is taken in by trees. Now, these trees may be eaten by animals. Animals can respire and release carbon dioxide in the air again. That causes it to be back in the atmosphere. Animals can also defecate, and basically carbon dioxide is produced as a result of that as well. And dead animals are also decomposed by decomposers. We saw in my little food chain in the previous slide. And these decomposers can decompose it aerobically or anaerobically. That means without using oxygen or with using oxygen to provide carbon, to produce carbon dioxide, which is released into the atmosphere or all over again. So you just have to know these processes and you need to know what removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that is photosynthesis and fossilization, and what adds it back, that is combustion, decomposition, and respiration. Okay. Next, the water cycle, probably my favorite. Oh, and yeah, all these pictures are taken from Save My Exams. They are literally the best. I still use them for AS level notes. Highly recommend. Okay, so yeah, water cycle, my favorite. So first, let's start with water in the ocean. Water evaporates. It forms water vapor. So evaporation is basically the conversion of water to water vapor over a range of temperatures. Okay, so basically what happens is then water vapor condenses to form clouds. Clouds cool and then precipitation occurs. Precipitation is basically raining, okay, where it converts to a liquid state. You need to know that condensation is when water vapor forms clouds and precipitation is when clouds form rain. You need to know that very well. And then again, water again flows back into oceans. Okay, and then some water is taken in by plants, so that is bioabsorption, and plants transpire. Transpiration is a consequence of gas exchange, as we know. So basically, during transpiration, plants lose water in the form of water vapor because water evaporates from the spongy mesophyll of their leaves. Okay, and then the water vapor diffuses out of the stomata. So again, water vapor forms, it condenses and forms clouds, cooling occurs, and precipitation occurs, and water flows back into the ocean. That's your water cycle. The next. Okay, the nitrogen cycle. This is new for all of you, and I'm pretty sure most kids hate it and get intimidated by it, but I'm here to not let that happen. So basically, this whole little box is a screenshot from your syllabus, and I'm just comparing it with my notes, and it is literally the exact same, like same box was the mark scheme of was the answer, like in the mark scheme of a paper. So just know it by heart. Honestly, it's so easy when you just look at it. But I can't believe I didn't even realize when I was in 10th grade that it was the same thing in the syllabus and in the mark scheme. But yeah. Okay, so I'm just gonna take you through these terms. They're pretty easy, I promise. So first we're gonna start again with atmospheric nitrogen, N2, nitrogen gas present in the air. So now what is nitrogen fixation? Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen gas into nitrate ions. This can happen by two mediums. One is lightning, okay, because what happens is there are high temperatures, okay, caused by like lightning. So nitrogen and oxygen, they react and they form nitrogen dioxide, and then nitrogen fixation occurs. So one, that is by lightning, and two is by bacteria called nitrogen fixation bacteria. So there's nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen fixation by lightning occurs, and nitrogen fixation by bacteria in the soil occurs, where basically nitrate ions are formed. Okay, so nitrogen to nitrate ions is nitrogen fixation. Ammonium ions to nitrate ions is nitrification. Okay, there is a difference. Okay, but we're going to look at that later. So nitrate ions are in the soil. Nitrate ions are absorbed by plants via active transport. I've already covered that in chapter 3. Active transport is the movement of ions from a region of lower concentration to higher concentration against their concentration gradient using energy from respiration. So yeah, um, plants absorb nitrate ions to, like I think we've already done that. NPK fertilizers, nitrogen is important. So it absorbs nitrogen ions. Uses nitrogen ions to form amino acids and proteins. So as we've learned, basically proteins have nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, in their like in amino acids. So to form this, you need nitrogen. So that is obtained from nitrate ions. Okay. So now these proteins, so basically these plants are fed on by animals. Animals digest the plants, and basically deamination happens. Now what is deamination? Deamination is the removal of a nitrogen containing component of an amino acid. So the nitrogen part of the amino acid is removed. So it is like deamination happens. Okay, and ammonium ions are formed. That's always the product of deamination. Ammonium ions are formed. These ammonium ions are converted to nitrate ions by nitrification. Okay, so basically, so one route of nitrogen is via nitrogen from the atmosphere or ammonium ions moves to plants. Plants make amino acids and proteins. They are ingested by animals, Animals, deamination happens in animals, ammonium ions are formed, nitrification happens, and nitrate ions are formed. So now how do nitrate ions go back, or how is nitrogen replenished in the atmosphere? That is via denitrification. So denitrification is nitrate ions to nitrogen gas. So nitrate ions in the soil are converted to converted to nitrogen gas molecules. So just know this in order. So we're going to look at this syllabus part. So plants and animal proteins decompose, okay, to form ammonium ions. Nitrification happens where ammonium ions are converted to nitrate ions. And nitrogen fixation occurs by lightning and bacteria when nitrogen in the air is converted to nitrate ions. So we have a surplus of nitrate ions. Nitrate ions are absorbed by plants. Amino acids and proteins are therefore produced by plants using the nitrate ions. These proteins are consumed by other organisms like animals. Deamination happens where the nitrogen containing part of an amino acid is removed to form ammonium ions. And these ammonium ions form nitrate ions via nitrification. And then these nitrate ions go back into the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas via denitrification. Pretty easy, I think so. Okay, again, email me if you have any doubts regarding this. Yes, we're getting to the end. Now, these three definitions you have to know by heart. You can get for like 2 or 3 marks. And you need to know it by heart because they come in MCQs. Okay, so don't mess this up. MCQ is 1 mark. Okay, so basically a population is a group of organisms of one species living in the same area at the same time. Okay, that's your definition. And the second line is what you can use for like other questions. So population size is affected by food supply, predation, and disease. Predation is like feeding off another organism. Like I just told, remember I showed you that food web and I said that if wrens were consumed and whatever, what would happen? So that's basically food supply and predation. Okay, and disease. I told you that if the um, something was wiped out by disease, what would happen to the others? So that's basically food supply, predation, and disease affect population, which is basically a group of organisms of one species living in the same area at the same time. Now, a community is the population of different species in an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is a unit containing the community of organisms and their environment interacting together. So it's basically population, community, ecosystem. Okay. You just have to memorize these terms. You just have to. There's no question about that. Okay, so the sigmoid population growth curve. So there are 4 phases. Remember it as LLSD, lag, log, stationary, and depth. So the lag phase, so we're gonna assume that there are yeast cells in a culture. Okay, so basically the first phase, the first time that the graph is stationary is the lag phase. It is when the yeast cells are acclimatizing themselves to the conditions prevalent or available in the culture. Then we have the log phase where there is a greater birth rate than death rate due to a surplus of nutrients. So there are lots of nutrients available, lots of glucose, lots of amino acids. So the yeast cells can use the nutrients to grow. So because birth rate is greater than death rate, there's net positive growth. Then we have the stationary phase where the birth rate equals the death rate. And basically, again, the graph line is stationary. There's no positive growth, no negative growth, nothing. And then we have the death phase where basically the death rate is greater than the birth rate. You have to always talk in terms of death rate, birth rate, amount of nutrients, what is the limiting factor. So in the death phase, the number of nutrients, or the volume of nutrients is the limiting factor because there are less nutrients present than the amount of yeast cells available. So some cells start dying because there's not enough nutrients available or present for life processes to occur. Okay, now I'm just going to go through some points that I've written in my notes. Factors that affect population increase. So, an increase in life expectancy, an increase in birth rate, a reduction in death rate, an increase in healthcare, a reduction in disease, an increase in modern vaccinations, an increase in agriculture, an increase in sanitation, an increase in clean water, an increase in fertility rate, and factors that cause a population to decrease are long and better education because people are more aware of the impact of greater populations on the environment, agriculture isn't labor intensive anymore. So if agriculture requires more capital, more machines, then people in the rural areas will have a smaller need to keep reproducing because you don't need so many hands on deck on a farm. Family planning schemes. If people are more aware of the use of contraceptives, then then population sizes decrease and better living conditions. So yes, that was those were my notes, and that was basically the chapter. I finally uploaded it. Finally, many of you guys asked me, and I'm so sorry I couldn't. But yeah, I hope this video helped you. If it did, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share this video with your friends. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or comment down in the comment sections below. Let's get through this together.